Hello, my name is Walker Pierce, and my case study is about the Algerian economy's experience with decolonization. Now, I know, colonization. You could say it's Europe's third favorite pastime, after football and unnecessary wars. But it's widely recognized as not the greatest system to guarantee indigenous rights. But even though that is an important topic in conversation, something I'm more interested in is what happens to the economies of countries that have recently undergone decolonization. And a really good example of one such country would be Algeria in the 1960s. Now, Algeria had the terribly unfortunate circumstance of being subjugated by the French. Of course, there's many French memes, but it was actually a very serious deal. They had a great deal of their rights taken away from them under French rule. Of course, there's many French memes, but it was actually a very serious deal. They had a great deal of their rights taken away from them under French rule, especially landowning rights. Very often, the French government would just decide that specific tracts of farmland would no longer be allowed to be owned by Algerian citizens and instead would be given to French farmhands who had gone over on promise of better wages. And the same thing happened in the cities as well, where French factory workers who were made obsolete by machines, especially landowning rights. Very often, the French government would just decide that specific tracts of farmland would no longer be allowed to be owned by Algerian citizens and instead would be given to French farmhands who had gone over on promise of better wages. And the same thing happened in the cities as well, where French factory workers who were made obsolete by machines and other economic innovations in France itself were given they were incentivized to move their production over to Algeria with guaranteed tools and higher wages potentially. And it got so bad that by the 1860s, the French government had kicked out all of the original Algerian population of the cities into ghettos and reserved the city centers for only French immigrants. By 1954, the Algerians had had enough of this discriminations, and emboldened by France's recent humiliation during World War II at the hands of Nazi Germany, they decided that they would try for independence. This particular war for independence started off quite small. In fact, it started off with only the robbing of a single post office to get enough money to buy a few guns and ammunition. And this happened in 1954. But over the years, it sort of ballooned into a very serious deal. And it was mostly confined, fighting that is, was mostly confined to urban centers. And it was a very asynchronous war. There was not very many massive troop movements going around. It was mostly small-scale skirmishes and also acts of terrorism, a lot of which can properly be considered war crimes. Now, after 8 years of fighting, very heavy urban fighting, the French population had grown war-weary of the situation, and there had actually been a coup d'etat led by famous World War II General Charles de Gaulle and the foundation of the new Fifth Republic of France. And Charles de Gaulle decided that in order to just end the war, he would grant Algeria independence and evacuate most of the French population. Of course, the new Algerian government was very happy about this fact, and a provisional government was formed with the help of the French. However, the provisional government and the Algerian National Army were not led by the same people, and there was a power struggle over who would control the actual territory of Algeria right after the French left. And Charles de Gaulle seems to have wanted the army to eventually gain control because he ordered his soldiers to help the army advance on Algiers, which is the capital of Algeria. And it was, in fact, the army who gained control after taking Algiers. And their leader, Ahmad Ben Bella, became the new head of state of the Algerian government. Now, Ahmad Ben Bella was a socialist, and this was a very common thing in Algeria. In fact, the revolution had been most of the soldiers of the revolution and most of its supporters had been socialists themselves. And also, Algeria had a very long history of socialist sympathies with some of the earliest settlers, including a man by the name of Emile Barros, specifically immigrating to Algeria to form a sort of socialist quasi-state that would still be dependent on France, but would serve as a model for socialism throughout the world. And he said, in my view, Algeria is the promised land of the chosen people, that is, the socialist people. So Ben Bella was engaging with a rich tradition of socialism already in Algeria. But Bella differed from the French socialists in one major way. He was totally opposed to Marxism, and instead he followed the philosophy of Islamic socialism. Islamic socialism was an attempt to marry conservative Islamic values, such as caring for your community, with social control of the economy, like in Marxist socialism. But they were very against the secularization that Marxism often brought. So the main way that Bella attempted to do this was through the use of policies known as autogestation, which is the idea that workers should form committees to control their own production. And this means that you have sort of quasi-labor unions controlling factories and farmers' unions controlling agriculture. So each worker has a say, a sort of a democratic vote in what they're going to do with the farm or the factory as a whole. And he did this very quickly between 1962 and 1963, so just 1 year, these policies were implemented. And unfortunately, this hasty implementation led to a huge decrease in the economic productivity of Algeria. In fact, for especially steel ingots and agricultural equipment, about 2/3 of production was lost between 1960 and 1963. And of course, 1960 was a wartime year, so you would expect it to be lower than average. But actually, after Bella's reforms, the economy was worse off than it was during the war. Now, this led Bella to be quite unpopular, and he was eventually deposed by a military coup d'etat in 1965. But Bella's centralization plans cannot be entirely blamed for the economic downturn that happened to Algeria after the revolution, as France retained ownership of the extensive mining networks in rural Algeria as part of their agreement to grant independence. And this caused a massive reduction in cash flow to the new nation. So that also contributed to the worsening production levels of the country. So, in conclusion, in the years immediately following decolonization in Algeria, the economy did not do very good, but that can be expected of any country that has recently been war-torn. Of course, the hastiness of the Bella government did not exactly help things, but it could have been far worse off. Thank you.